Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm just trying to figure out my technology on the screen. And so I'm looking forward to our conversation at the end. There's a number of points where you'll see we'll come into conversation with each other.
Gladly.
So I'm new to the crowd, so I thought I would introduce myself starting out. I'm Marta Shaw. I have worked with Marta Lenartowicz before. I work at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. But I also want to, as I start, bring you into a different corner of my world. I think you can all picture what it's like to work at a university. I'm also involved with a community called SLOT, which organizes the largest alternative art festival in Poland, which is one of the educational contexts that have shaped me. So as a self-disclosure of who you're going to have to do with, this is a little picture of SLOT. It happens in the grounds of the largest monastic complex in Poland, near Wrocław. You're all invited to come, and I just want to show you a brief snippet. Marta Lenartowicz has been there and has spoken there. So here's just a little picture of what it looks like. Just a couple days a year, a gigantic monastery turns into SLOT, a little town bursting with life, with 150 workshops, 100 concerts, meetings, rooms, and cafes. Create with us what is common. So the snippet's a little old, but it's still happening despite COVID. And it's a good metaphor for a couple of the things that I'll be talking about. So as I think about the goal of education, or what education is for, this quote comes to mind by Aldous Huxley, whom I didn't know as a philosopher until very recently. And he wrote a brilliant little book called Ends and Means. And he says this about the goal of human effort. And as we ask about the goal of education, the goal of human effort is a good place to begin. And he says the ideal goal of human effort has been the subject of a good deal of agreement, which surprised me when I first read this. He says, from Isaiah to Karl Marx, the prophets have spoken with one voice. In the golden age to which they look forward, there will be liberty, peace, justice, and brotherly love. Not so with regard to the roads which lead to that goal, right? Here, unanimity and certainty give place to utter confusion, to the clash of contradictory opinions. We defend them dogmatically with the violence of fanaticism. So I love that quote, and I like it as a place to begin thinking about what education's for. It's about a path to this place we all want to get to, right? Where the world is a better place, where there's peace, justice, liberty, brotherly love. So how do we get there? I have two young children who are watching cartoons right now as I do this. Here's a picture of them in a rare moment when, other than when watching cartoons, they're not fighting with each other. And it's been quite amazing to me as a mom of two little ones, how much work it takes to get children to not be violent to each other. One will take the other's toy. They're 3 and 4, both boys. There's a long way to go for them before we manage to teach them that hitting each other is not an okay response when someone takes something you want, right? And we've traveled around the world. We lived in 2 different countries, and in the places where we've lived and where we've been, it is common practice for parents and others in society to tell children not to hit each other. That seems to be one of the things that we've agreed on as a means to getting to the sort of world we want. We don't want a world where people solve conflict through violence, right? And we've come a long way, and Harari shows this quite well in his books. We don't die of violence anymore, partly because we've agreed on this very thing. And with that, I need to say a couple of things that will be obvious, but I will say them anyway. I'm a linguist by my first training. I was a linguist in my past life. And it's an obvious obviosity, but we think in metaphors, right? I learned in my training as a linguist that metaphors are not these optional figures of speech, and all thinking is fundamentally metaphorical. There's this quote I really like by C.S. Lewis that gets at that. Metaphors are not just these optional tools for poets, right? Not just words or images that help us describe some sort of a concept that exists in the mind. This metaphorical connection is how our brains understand anything. Anything new that we understand by means of connecting it to what we already know, comparing it to something we already know. So I think you all know a lot more about this than I do at this point. But kind of the introductory thesis here is that, especially when it comes to these deepest metaphors, what Johnson and Lakoff call ontological metaphors, they're not optional, they're a kind of sense, right? They're like seeing, they're like hearing. And especially when we speak and think about things we can't see, like our own mind, we have to speak and we have to think as if we could see them, right? So the economy grows, we say, like trees and flowers grow, or an institution grows, right? Or we say that energy is released as if it were an animal set free from a cage. Thus, like C.S. Lewis says, that books on psychology or economics are as metaphorical as books of poetry and devotion. So my thesis today that I'd like to discuss with you is that we seem to understand our own minds by reference to our technology, and the metaphors that we use to describe our own minds, the metaphors that organize the way that we think and talk about our minds, have some implicit assumptions about them that affect the way that we do education. And it's an interesting question for me where we are when it comes to that today. So here's a picture of a couple of elephants. Back in the day, the most advanced technology people had were the animals that they domesticated. So there's this quote by the Buddha, right, who compared the mind to this wild elephant who needs to be controlled by the trainer, right? So it's this picture of a wild animal where the goal of education, if we understand the mind as a wild animal, is to train the trainer, right? To give the trainer more control over the animal, if this is how we look at it, right? The other example I have up here is also from the world of wild animals. It's from Plato. In Plato's Phaedrus, we have this image of the mind as a chariot drawn by two horses. So there's the white horse, right, which is the good horse, and there's the black horse, and then there's the charioteer. And the goal of education, again, is to help the charioteer gain control over these two horses. And I think I have a quote up here from Plato too. The horse on the right is on the nobler side, is upright in flame and well jointed. I like this one about the high neck and the regal nose. He's a lover of honor, with modesty and self-control, companion to true glory. He needs no whip, is guided by verbal commands alone. And this other horse is maybe more like Buddha's elephant, right? This great jumble of limbs, companion to wild boasts of indecency. He's shaggy around the ears and deaf as a post, barely yields to horsewhip and goad combined, right? So a different picture of the mind, which has its implications for how we do education then, right? There is a good horse that we have to work with, but there's also the bad one. And education's about equipping the rider with the sorts of tools that the rider needs in order to control these two horses. So the implied purpose of education, as long as our most advanced technology was the animals we've domesticated, animals which are part of the biological world, in both of these cases, animals that are larger than ourselves, right, is to gain control of the inner animal, which has more strength. It's larger than me, but I'm more intelligent than the animal. So education is about giving me the sorts of tools, the knowledge I need, but also the kind of inner strength of character that I need to control the inner animal. Now, of course, all of this changed with Freud. Freud is the one who kind of brought to our attention just how difficult it is, just how impossible it is, perhaps, to not just control the inner animal, but to even be aware of the inner animal. And I like this quote from Jonathan Haidt, a great book called Happiness from the Ancients till the Modern Day, or something to that effect. I read it in Polish. And he says when he lectures on Freud, he thinks of the mind in Freud's thinking as a horse and buggy, kind of a Victorian version of the chariot, where there's not just the driver struggling to control this disobedient horse, which is a familiar trope here, right, from the earlier metaphors. But we also have the driver's father who's sitting in the back seat, kind of lecturing the driver on what to do and what he's doing wrong. And the implied purpose of education here, with this metaphor, would be strengthening the charioteer, so that the charioteer is not only controlling the horse, but also gaining a level of independence from the backseat driving father of the superego, right? So that's Freud. There's also the religious aims of education and religious metaphors. My children are in a Catholic Montessori preschool, which is a very interesting, as of 2 weeks ago. So it's an interesting other world to explore there. But where I'd like to go today is what happened with the Enlightenment, which Saifan, you also referred to, with this striving for order, obedience, reliability. This is the time when the leading technology became the machines that we built. And this is also where we start talking about the mind as a machine. And this is something that's deeply embedded in our languages in the West, right? We have this ontological metaphor. So it's not just in our language, but it's in the very structure of our thinking, that the mind is a thing and the mind is a machine. And Lakoff and Johnson write about that. So an ontological metaphor is a means to understand events or processes or feelings as things, as substances. And we understand our own mind in the West since the Enlightenment as a thing, and not just anything, as a machine. And the metaphors that we use kind of are telling, right? We say, oh, my head's just not working properly today. Or I'm looking at you on the Zoom screen and can say, oh, I can just really see the wheels turning. Right? It's something we say, or we say, I just had a brain freeze, or something, some news just broke my brain, right? We think and structure our thinking about our own mind as if it were a machine. And of course, the problematic part of that is our mind is so complex that we'll never understand it. We like machines because we understand them, right? We built them. And this metaphor does give us a way to make sense of our mind, but how do we make sense of it, right? What is it? Was it an imply? What biases does it carry? So, well, it means we think our mind can be on or off. If it's a machine, it's black or white, right? It has a certain level of efficiency. It has an energy source that makes sense to us. It also has a consistent and predictable mechanism of functioning. Those are all implied in this ontological metaphor of a mechanism. Our mind as a mechanism. And this has implications. Saifan, you talked about this crazy rate of growth that we have. It's rooted in notions in economics that draw on this mechanistic metaphor, right? We see the world is in a mechanistic way as a reflection of our minds, but this idea of an economic man, right? The Homo economicus, who pursues the subjectively defined ends in a consistently rational way. It's not really a man, it's a machine. And I'm a perfectionist, so you can ask my husband. He's living with the day-to-day implications of what this means, right? And what this metaphor obscures from view. I don't know about you. I often treat myself like a machine and evaluate my day based on how many things I managed to check off the list. And we tend to do that to ourselves. We tend to do that to our world. And if this is really true, if the ontological metaphor that guides our thinking is one of a machine or a watch, then what's the implication? The computer is just a newer type of machine. The implied purpose of education would be to provide information and resources, right? If there's a machine that has inputs and outputs, then what's required is it needs information to act on, it needs resources to act on. Okay, we're gonna have a little guest joining. This is Daniel. This is who I was talking about. He's gonna be shy. He's a little non-machine, as you can see. If he were a machine, he would be watching a cartoon like his brother. Yeah, and where Daniel differs from a machine is defined really well by Franz de Waal in Mama's Last Hug, which is appropriate given the situation. De Waal talks about how our mind is nothing like a machine. In fact, it's more like a gelatinous soup than a machine. It has billions and billions of connections, incredibly integrated, right? We're at a place in our knowledge of ourselves where we understand just how different we are from a machine. And de Waal says organisms actually have nothing in common with machines. I maybe wouldn't go as far as to say that. He's saying the clock and computer metaphors are completely useless. And they've certainly done a whole lot of harm to ourselves, to biological life on this planet. And in light of that, this quote came to mind from St. Paul that knowledge puffs up while love builds up. So the more important thing I do here is related to this one than all the knowledge I'm transmitting. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. Yeah, and this is the picture of the world we live in. Our knowledge has puffed us up. Our greatest threat is our own efficiency in achieving our short-term ends. So the question I'd like to discuss with you in light of where we are today, what is our default metaphor of the mind now? I'm very interested in this group because of the network metaphors that you work with. But then what implications this has for how we think of the purpose of education. And perhaps the most interesting question here for me is, what does our dominant metaphor actually obscure? Every metaphor reveals something, but it also obscures something else. So what is this network metaphor? If this is the one, I'm curious what you will say. What does it actually obscure from view, like the mechanistic ones did in the past? So those are some things I'd be interested in discussing in our time together.